a black lawyer, fresh off a major courtroom victory, was on his way home when his life took an unexpected turn. At a routine checkpoint in the courthouse, a racist officer singled him out, questioning his credentials and humiliating him in front of others. The officer sneered, dismissing the lawyer's authority with a condescending smirk. But within 15 minutes, the tables turned in a way no one could have predicted. What happened next stunned the entire courthouse, leading to consequences no one saw coming. The confrontation didn't just expose one man's prejudice, it set off a ripple effect that changed the way justice was perceived in that very building. Stay with me, this is a story that goes beyond one moment, shedding light on the quiet battles fought every day. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more like this. The courthouse was awake but quiet, its fluorescent lights humming softly like a choir that had forgotten its song. Judge Alicia Monroe stepped inside, her leather briefcase weighing down one shoulder. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor, each sound sharp, purposeful, like a heartbeat determined to rise above the noise. Today was no ordinary day. It was sentencing day, the final chapter in a high-profile case that had gripped the nation. Justice, Alicia thought, would be served today if it allowed itself to be. The lobby was nearly empty, save for the security officers stationed at the checkpoint. Officer Daniels leaned against the metal detector, his blue uniform spotless, his presence unmistakably imposing. He didn't move as Alicia approached, he just watched her, his pale eyes fixed on her like a hawk sizing up prey. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of her authority, only that glare, a subtle, silent reminder of the lines he believed should not be crossed. ID. Daniels barked when she was close enough to hear. The words sliced through the stillness, sharp and unnecessary. Alicia had been through this checkpoint countless times before. They all knew her. They all knew what she stood for. She paused, letting the silence linger for just a moment too long. "Good morning to you too, Officer Daniels," she replied, her voice smooth, unyielding. She reached into her bag and produced her government-issued badge, the one that bore her title, her name, her hard-earned authority. Judge Alicia Monroe. Daniels snatched the badge from her hand, inspecting it as if it were counterfeit. His lips curled into a smirk. "Judge, huh?" he said, his tone laced with disbelief. "You don't look like a judge." There it was. Alicia felt the weight of those words settle in the room like a thick fog. It wasn't the first time she'd heard them, and it wouldn't be the last. "And what exactly does a judge look like, Officer Daniels?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying the sharpness of a blade. Daniels ignored the question, holding her badge up to the light as though searching for invisible flaws. "Step aside," he said, gesturing toward a small area to the left. "I need to run a secondary check." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances. None of them said a word. Alicia adjusted her briefcase strap and moved to the designated area. She'd learned long ago not to show anger in moments like these. Anger was what men like Daniels fed on. Instead, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and walked with the poise of someone who knew the game and had no intention of losing. Daniels followed, standing a little too close, his presence a deliberate act of intimidation. "You know," he said, crossing his arms, "we get a lot of people around here claiming to be someone important. You can't trust everything you see on a badge." Alicia turned to face him fully, studying his face like a lawyer dissecting an argument. "And what would you suggest I do, Officer Daniels? Wear a robe and carry a gavel at all times?" Daniels chuckled, the sound hollow and mocking. "Funny, but no, Judge, I think you'll need to answer a few questions." Her mind raced, calculating every word, every movement. This wasn't just about her, it never was. This was about the unspoken rules that defined Liv's, hers, Daniels, and everyone else's. Rules that said she didn't belong in the seat of power she occupied. Rules that allowed men like him to question her existence, her legitimacy. "What grounds do you have to question me, Officer Daniels?" she asked, her voice steady, almost curious. Daniels shrugged, his smirk widening. "Just procedure. You don't seem like the type who'd understand the gravity of the law. You're, what, early 40s? Got lucky? Pulled a few strings?" It wasn't the words that stung, it was the ease with which he said them. The casual dismissal of everything she'd worked for. Alicia allowed herself a small, composed smile. So my years of legal education, my tenure on the bench, and the rulings I've made in high-stakes cases mean nothing because you've decided to play arbiter of legitimacy today? Daniels leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Listen, lady, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. No, Alicia said, her voice low but firm. You bend them. The air between them crackled with tension. Alicia could feel the eyes of the other officers on her, their discomfort palpable. Daniels, however, was unfazed. I'm just doing my job, he said with a sneer. And I'm doing mine, Alicia replied, although I find it fascinating that your job seems to involve singling out individuals who don't fit your narrow expectations of authority. For a moment, Daniels' smirk faltered. He reached for his radio with exaggerated movements, broadcasting loudly enough for everyone to hear. I'm going to need verification on a questionable ID. Alicia stood still, her calm demeanor masking the fire building within her. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sleek recording device. Pressing a button with deliberate precision, a faint beep sounded, and a robotic voice announced, "Recording started." Daniels froze, his bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. Alicia's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unyielding. You see, Officer Daniels, I've learned to document interactions like these. For accountability, of course. The balance of power shifted. The room, once his stage, now belonged to her. Daniels' smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. The other officers exchanged glances, their unease growing by the second. Now, Alicia continued, her tone smooth as silk. Why don't we proceed with this procedure of yours? I'd love to see how it aligns with department policy. Daniels didn't respond. For the first time, he looked uncertain. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Alicia broke it with a single, cutting sentence. Or we can call your supervisor and settle this matter right now. Daniels hesitated, his hand hovering over his radio. Alicia didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of her presence, her authority, was enough to fill the room. She'd been through this before, and she'd be through it again. But this time, she wouldn't just endure, she'd hold them accountable. This wasn't just her fight. It was everyone's. And today, she'd make sure that no one watching would ever forget it. The side screening area felt colder, as though the air itself had been drained of warmth and goodwill. Alicia Monroe stood tall, her leather briefcase still in her hand, her face a portrait of calm authority. Behind her calm, though, lay a truth she could not ignore. The deeper humiliation was never the overt aggression but the subtle, insidious doubt, the kind that crept into daily life like a shadow cast too long by a fading sun. Officer Daniels stepped into the space after her, his posture still bearing that peculiar combination of entitlement and defiance. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not here, not by someone like her. Face forward, he commanded, his voice gruff, as though he were addressing a suspect rather than a sitting judge. He gestured to a handheld scanner, wielding it with an unnecessary flourish. Alicia complied, unflinching, her movements deliberate. She would not let him see anything he could mistake for fear. As Daniels moved the scanner over her shoulders, the metallic hum filled the silence. You know, he said, the disdain barely hidden in his tone. I've been doing this job a long time. You can tell a lot about people just by the way they carry themselves. And what exactly have you deduced about me, Officer Daniels? Alicia asked, her voice measured. It was the kind of question that felt polite on the surface but carried daggers underneath. Daniels paused, the scanner hovering over her bag. He glanced down at her briefcase, then up at her face, his smirk returning like a bad habit. I'm just saying, some folks think they're better than others because of a title. But titles don't mean much when it comes to character. The words landed like an insult dressed as a sermon. And Alicia felt the familiar sting, the kind of sting she'd learned to transform into fuel. Interesting, she replied, tilting her head slightly, her eyes steady on his. And I imagine you consider yourself an excellent judge of character. Daniel's smirk widened. I've seen all kinds, he said. It's not hard to spot the ones who got where they're by cutting corners. Alicia smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. Then it must be difficult for you to recognize integrity when it's right in front of you. The air between them was electric, the kind of tension that words couldn't dissipate. Daniel's grip tightened on the scanner as he resumed his deliberate pace. Alicia stood silent, her calm demeanor intact, but her mind raced. She thought of the many faces she'd seen in her courtroom, some defiant, some broken, all carrying the weight of their own stories. How many of them had been judged unfairly before they even opened their mouths? "Bag," Daniels said curtly, interrupting her thoughts. Alicia handed over her briefcase, watching as he opened it and rifled through its contents with the carelessness of someone searching for validation. He lingered on her leather-bound notebook, flipping it open as though expecting to find something incriminating. His eyes scanned the neat rows of handwriting, then flicked back to her with thinly veiled contempt. "You write everything down, huh?" he said, tossing the notebook back into the briefcase without bothering to close it. "Guess it helps to keep track of who owes you favors." Alicia's patience was wearing thin, but she held her ground. "No," she said evenly. "It helps to ensure accuracy when delivering justice." Daniels huffed, clearly unimpressed, and closed the briefcase with a snap. "You can go," he said, stepping back as though dismissing her from his presence. But Alicia didn't move. "Not yet. Before I leave," she said, her voice low but firm, "I'd like you to answer one question for me." "Officer Daniels." Daniels folded his arms, his smirk returning. "What's that?" Alicia took a small step forward, her gaze never wavering. "Why do you feel the need to assert your authority over someone whose credentials are beyond question?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. For a moment, Daniels said nothing, his smirk faltering just enough to reveal a hint of unease. But before he could respond, another officer appeared at the edge of the screening area, a younger man with dark eyes that darted nervously between Alicia and Daniels. "Everything okay here?" the younger officer asked, his voice tentative. Daniels straightened, his confidence returning as he turned toward the newcomer. "Just doing my job," he said dismissively, waving the scanner for emphasis. The younger officer hesitated, his gaze flicking to Alicia. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken understanding, perhaps, or an apology he wasn't sure how to voice. Alicia gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of his presence. "Of course," she said, turning her attention back to Daniels. "Your job." And with that, she picked up her briefcase, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and walked out of the screening area. Her heels clicked against the floor with the same deliberate rhythm, each step a declaration that she would not be diminished by the likes of Officer Daniels. But as she crossed the lobby and approached the courtroom doors, she couldn't ignore the weight that lingered in her chest. It wasn't just about her. It never was. Daniels was just one man in a system that thrived on quiet battles like this, battles that most people never saw. Battles that wore you down in ways you couldn't always name. Alicia paused at the heavy wooden doors, her hand resting on the cool metal handle. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Inside, the courtroom waited, the reporters, the attorneys, the spectators, all ready for the sentencing that would make headlines. But for Alicia, the real trial had already begun. It wasn't in the courtroom. It was here, in the lobby, in the side screening area, in every unspoken rule that told her she didn't belong. And yet, here she was. She pushed open the doors, her head held high. The battle wasn't over. It never would be. But as long as she had breath in her body, she would fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in a world that demanded they shrink. This was the quiet war. And Alicia Monroe was a soldier who refused to surrender. The courtroom was alive with anticipation, its occupants buzzing like a restless hive. Reporters adjusted their equipment, lawyers whispered hurried strategies, and spectators craned their necks for the best view of the woman at the center of it all, Judge Alicia Monroe. The heavy air carried a sense of gravity, of justice waiting to be served. But Alicia, seated at the bench, felt the lingering weight of the earlier confrontation. The courtroom was her sanctuary. Yet the echoes of the lobby confrontation trailed her, a shadow that refused to dissipate. She scanned the room, her gaze steady and composed. There were familiar faces, attorneys she'd sparred with before, clerks she relied upon, and unfamiliar ones. Particularly in the gallery, a few reporters scribbled notes, their eyes darting between her and the defense table. A subtle shift of their focus reminded her of the silent undercurrents that coursed through every space she occupied. To them, she wasn't just a judge presiding over a high-profile case. She was also a symbol. And symbols, Alicia knew, carried burdens that people rarely acknowledged. "Order in the court," Alicia said, her voice firm. cutting through the hum of anticipation. The room fell silent, all eyes now fixed on her. As the opening statements began, Alicia's attention sharpened, her mind attuned to every word, every gesture. The defendant, a corporate executive accused of environmental crimes, sat at the defense table. His posture relaxed, his expression almost smug. The prosecution laid out its case with precision, highlighting the devastation wrought by the defendant's decisions. Yet Alicia noticed how the defense attorney's arguments seemed less focused on facts and more on casting doubt, subtly appealing to biases rather than evidence. It wasn't overt, rarely was it ever, but Alicia could see the threads of prejudice woven into the narrative. The prosecutor, a black woman named Camille Harper, faced subtle but constant challenges from the defense. Interruptions, condescension, questions about her qualifications, tactics. Alicia had faced herself, watching Camille navigate the courtroom with grace and resolve. Alicia felt a flicker of solidarity. They were playing the same game, though on different stages. The proceedings continued, each side presenting its case with increasing intensity. But beneath the surface, Alicia could feel the tension mounting, not just between the lawyers but within the room itself. The gallery murmured during Camille's arguments, their reactions muted but telling. Alicia's gavel brought silence each time, but the whispers lingered, a reminder that justice was never blind to the biases of the world outside its walls. As the day wore on, Alicia called for a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, the tension following the crowd into the hallways. Alicia remained seated, her gaze fixed on the empty defendant's table. She had seen this dynamic play out countless times, those with power assuming it would shield them, those without fighting to be heard. And here she was, tasked with weighing it all, knowing that every decision she made carried the weight of more than just the law. A knock at the door of her chambers broke her reverie. "Come in," she said, her tone even. The door opened to reveal Camille, her expression both determined and weary. "Judge Monroe," she began, stepping inside. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Alicia replied, gesturing to a chair. "Please, sit." Camille hesitated before sitting, her posture stiff. "I wanted to thank you for keeping the courtroom in order. It's challenging sometimes." Alicia leaned back in her chair, studying the younger woman. "Challenging is an understatement," she said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "But you handled yourself well." Camille nodded, though her expression didn't soften. It's hard not to feel like I'm fighting on two fronts. The case itself and everything else." Alicia knew exactly what she meant. Everything else was the unspoken prejudice, the subtle dismissals, the constant need to prove oneself. It was the same battle Alicia had fought earlier that morning, the same one she had faced for years. "You're not imagining it," Alicia said, her voice gentle but firm. "The resistance you feel, the double standards, it's real. But that doesn't mean you let it stop you." Camille's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her eyes still held a glimmer of doubt. "Does it ever get easier?" Alicia considered the question carefully. "It gets different," she said finally. "You learn to navigate it, to use their underestimation of you as fuel. But the world doesn't change overnight. You have to decide what kind of change you're willing to fight for, even if it's slow." Camille nodded again, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Judge Monroe. I appreciate your honesty." Alicia smiled faintly. "We need more people like you in these courtrooms. Camille, don't let them push you out." The younger woman stood, her posture straighter now. "I won't," she said, her voice firm. "Thank you again." As Camille left, Alicia leaned back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. The courtroom, the lobby, the chambers, they were all battlegrounds, each with its own rules and challenges. And yet, the fight was the same, to assert one's place in a world that constantly questioned it. The remainder of the day unfolded with its own set of challenges. The defense ramped up its attacks. The gallery grew more restless, and Alicia found herself wielding her gavel more often. But through it all, she maintained her composure, her resolve unshaken. As the session adjourned and the courtroom emptied once more, Alicia lingered at the bench, her fingers resting lightly on the wood. The fight was far from over, both in the case and in the world outside. But she would continue, as she always had, knowing that every battle, every decision, was part of a larger struggle for justice. And she was prepared to fight it, one quiet battle at a time. The courthouse lobby was quieter now, emptied of the thrumming crowd from earlier. but the echoes of the day's proceedings seemed to linger in its walls. Judge Alicia Monroe descended the marble steps from her chambers, her briefcase in hand, her heels clicking steadily against the floor. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, pulling her into their grasp. She had one more task before she could leave for the day, a meeting with Captain Morales, the head of courthouse security. The earlier confrontation with Officer Daniels still clung to her like a stubborn shadow. Accountability, she reminded herself, was not a gift, it was a demand, and she intended to make it. As she approached the security office, she noticed a group of officers gathered just outside, their voices low, their postures tense. When they saw her, the conversation fell silent, the men shifting awkwardly as though caught in the act of saying something they shouldn't. "Judge Monroe," one of them said, his voice polite but stiff. "Captain Morales is expecting you." Alicia nodded, offering a brief smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She could feel the weight of their gazes as she stepped past them and into the office. Captain Morales rose from his desk when she entered, his expression somber but resolute. He was an older man, his hair streaked with gray, his uniform immaculate. "Judge Monroe," he said, extending a hand, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Alicia set her briefcase down and took the chair across from him, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. "Captain Morales," she began, her tone measured, "I trust you've had time to review the incident from this morning." Morales sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I have. And let me start by saying that what happened was unacceptable. Officer Daniels' behavior does not reflect the values of this department." Alicia raised an eyebrow, her expression neutral but questioning. "And yet, it happened. This isn't the first time I've encountered this kind of treatment, Captain. Nor, I suspect, will it be the last." Morales nodded, his face grim. "You're right, and that's why we're taking this seriously. Daniels has been removed from his post pending a full review. There will be consequences." Alicia leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the edge of his desk. "I appreciate that, Captain, but this isn't just about Officer Daniels. It's about the culture that allows someone like him to feel emboldened to act this way. Addressing one officer's behavior won't fix the larger problem." Morales hesitated, his eyes dropping briefly to his desk. "I understand your frustration," he said finally. "Change takes time. Time is a luxury many of us can't afford." Alicia replied, her voice sharp but controlled. "Every day that this culture persists, it chips away at the trust people should have in the justice system. And trust, Captain, is not easily restored." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken truths and shared frustrations. Morales finally looked up, his expression weary but determined. "What do you suggest?" Alicia allowed a small, composed smile to cross her face. "Start with transparency. Make the review process public. Let people see that accountability isn't just a word you use when it's convenient. And invest in real training, not just a box to check off." Morales nodded slowly. "You're right," he said again. "We can do better. We will do better." Their conversation ended shortly after, and Alicia left the office feeling a mixture of satisfaction and lingering doubt. Progress, she knew, was rarely linear. It was a series of small victories and stubborn setbacks, each one testing your resolve. As she made her way toward the exit, she noticed a figure standing near the security checkpoint. Officer Daniels. He wasn't in uniform, instead. He wore a plain shirt and jeans, his posture stiff, his face set in a tight mask of discomfort. "Judge Monroe," he said as she approached, his voice hesitant. "Can I have a moment?" Alicia stopped, her expression unreadable. "Officer Daniels," she replied, her tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting around the empty lobby. I wanted to apologize. For this morning, I was out of line." The words hung in the air, heavy with tension. Alicia studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. "You were," she said bluntly, "but an apology is a start." Daniels nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know I messed up. I guess I didn't think." "That's the problem, Officer Daniels," Alicia replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "You didn't think. You acted on assumptions, and those assumptions have consequences." Daniels looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping. "I'll do better," he said quietly. "We'll see," Alicia said, her tone measured. "Change isn't about words, Officer Daniels. It's about actions." She left him standing there, his apology lingering in the air like an unfinished sentence. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted her, sharp and bracing. The sun had begun to set, casting the city in shades of orange and gold. Alicia paused at the top of the courthouse steps, her gaze sweeping over the bustling streets below. The world carried on, oblivious to the battles fought within its institutions. But Alicia knew the truth. The quiet erosion of justice was just as dangerous as any overt attack. And it was her job, her duty, to push back against it. No matter how exhausting the fight. She took a deep breath, the chill in the air filling her lungs. Then, with her head held high and her resolve unshaken, she descended the steps, ready to face whatever came next. The morning after the confrontation with Officer Daniels, the courthouse felt heavier, as if the very air carried the weight of unspoken reckonings. Judge Alicia Monroe entered through a side door this time, avoiding the lobby entirely. She had no interest in giving the officers another chance to test her patience or their own integrity. Yet even as she walked the quieter hallways, she knew that the dynamics of power and prejudice were not confined to checkpoints and metal detectors. They existed in every conversation, every glance, every interaction. Alicia's chambers were her refuge, though even there, the world's incessant demands crept in. As she sat at her desk reviewing case notes, a soft knock broke her concentration. "Come in," she called, her tone brisk. Her clerk, Sarah Townsend, stepped inside. The younger woman's face bore an expression of quiet unease, a hesitance Alicia had come to recognize over the years. "Judge Monroe," Sarah began, her voice cautious, "there's something you should know." Alicia leaned back in her chair, setting her pen down. "Go on." Sarah hesitated, then stepped closer. "It's about Officer Daniels. There's been talk among the courthouse staff. People are saying he's been complaining about how you handled the situation yesterday." Alicia's jaw tightened, though she kept her expression neutral. "Complaining?" Sarah nodded. "He's claiming you overreacted, that you humiliated him in front of his colleagues. Some people seem to agree with him." Alicia felt a flicker of anger, but she quickly tamped it down. This, too, was familiar territory, the way those who challenged authority were often recast as aggressors. "Thank you for telling me, Sarah," she said. "I'll handle it." Sarah nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Judge, I think you did the right thing." Alicia offered a faint smile. "Thank you, Sarah." When the door closed, Alicia allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had no illusions about the cost of speaking up, of demanding accountability. People like Daniels relied on silence to maintain their power, and any challenge to that power was met with resistance, both overt and covert. But Alicia had never been one to back down from resistance. Later that morning, the courtroom filled once again, its occupants brimming with anticipation for the next phase of the high-profile trial. Alicia entered with her usual composure, her presence commanding the room's attention. She took her seat at the bench, adjusted her robe, and called the session to order. The prosecution resumed its arguments, presenting a series of damning evidence against the defendant. Camille Harper, the lead prosecutor, was sharp and unrelenting, her voice steady as she dissected the defense's attempts to obfuscate the truth. Alicia watched her closely, impressed by her poise under pressure. But as the arguments progressed, Alicia couldn't ignore the subtle dynamics at play. The defense attorney, a man named Robert Pierce, interrupted Camille repeatedly, his tone dripping with condescension. He masked his disdain behind a veneer of professionalism, but the intent was clear. "Objection, Your Honor," Pierce said for the third time in as many minutes. "The prosecutor is engaging in speculation." Camille straightened, her expression calm but resolute. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. I'm simply connecting the facts." Alicia leaned forward slightly, her voice firm. "Overruled. Please proceed, Ms. Harper." Pierce's lips tightened, his frustration evident. He cast a glance toward the jury, as if to suggest that Alicia's ruling was biased. The move was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Alicia caught it. She had seen it before, the silent implication that her authority was somehow suspect, that her decisions were driven by something other than the law. The trial continued, the tension in the room mounting with each passing hour. When the session finally adjourned for the day, Alicia returned to her chambers. her mind heavy with the weight of it all. That evening, Alicia attended a small reception for local community leaders. The event was held in a stately building downtown, its grand halls filled with the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses. Alicia mingled politely, her presence a reminder of the role she played not just in the courthouse but in the broader fabric of the community. As the evening wore on, she found herself in a quiet corner speaking with Reverend Charles Bennett, a longtime advocate for social justice. The older man's eyes were sharp, his words measured. "I heard about the incident with that officer," Bennett said, his tone low but firm. "Sounds like you handled yourself well." Alicia nodded, sipping her glass of water. "I did what was necessary. But the fallout is predictable." Bennett chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "It always is. People don't like their power being questioned. And when it's a black woman doing the questioning, well, that's a threat they don't know how to handle." Alicia sighed, her gaze drifting toward the grand windows that overlooked the city. "Sometimes it feels like no matter how much progress we make, the fight never really ends." "It doesn't," Bennett said simply. "But that's why we keep fighting. Every act of resistance, every quiet disobedience, it all matters. Even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment." Alicia turned back to him, her expression thoughtful. "How do you keep going? After all these years?" Bennett smiled faintly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Because I have to believe that what we do today lays the foundation for something better tomorrow. And because the alternative, giving up, isn't an option." His words stayed with her long after the reception ended. As Alicia drove home, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white, she thought about the quiet battles that defined her life. The courtroom, the lobby, the halls of power, they were all arenas where the fight for justice played out. Sometimes in ways that were obvious, but more often in ways that were invisible to most. But Alicia knew this truth. The small acts mattered. The subtle disobediences, the insistence on being seen and heard, they were the building blocks of change. And as long as she had a voice, she would use it, because the fight, no matter how exhausting, was worth it. It always had been. The courthouse hummed with its usual rhythm the next day, the kind of rhythm that masked deeper tensions beneath its surface. Judge Alicia Monroe arrived early, her steps deliberate, her mind already preparing for the day ahead. She had long learned to anticipate the unexpected, to brace for the subtle slights and overt challenges that accompanied her role. But knowing didn't make the weight of it any lighter. As she passed through the halls, she caught snippets of conversation, voices hushed, glances darting her way. Word of her confrontation with Officer Daniels had spread, rippling through the courthouse like an undercurrent. To some, she was a hero for standing firm. To others, she was a disruptor, someone who had upset the fragile balance of unspoken hierarchies. She reached her chambers and settled into her chair, her gaze lingering on the neatly arranged files on her desk. Today's docket was full, including the continuation of the high-profile trial that had dominated the courthouse for weeks. But her focus was interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she said, her tone steady. The door opened, revealing Captain Morales. His expression was guarded, his posture stiff, as though bracing for a difficult conversation. "Judge Monroe," he began, stepping inside. "Do you have a moment?" Alicia gestured for him to sit. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Morales hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the door before returning to her. "It's about Officer Daniels," he said, his voice low. "The internal review is ongoing. But there's been pushback." "Pushback?" Alicia repeated, raising an eyebrow. "From whom?" "Some of the other officers," Morales admitted. "They feel that Daniels was unfairly targeted, that his actions were blown out of proportion." Alicia leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but unyielding. "And what do you think, Captain?" Morales sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I think Daniels was wrong. But this kind of pushback, it's not unusual. People don't like change, especially when it forces them to confront uncomfortable truths." "Uncomfortable for whom?" Alicia asked, her tone sharp but measured. "For the officers who witnessed his behavior and said nothing? For the system that allows this kind of prejudice to persist?" Morales nodded, his face etched with weariness. "All of the above. I just wanted to make you aware. These things have a way of escalating." Alicia studied him for a moment before speaking. "Captain, I appreciate your candor. But let me be clear. I didn't escalate this situation, Daniels did. With his actions. And if holding him accountable makes people uncomfortable, Then perhaps they should examine why. Morales nodded again, though his expression remained troubled. Understood, Judge Monroe. As he left, Alicia felt a familiar mix of frustration and resolve. She knew that change was never easy. That pushing against entrenched systems came with resistance. But she also knew that the cost of silence was far greater. The courtroom was packed that afternoon, the air thick with anticipation as the trial resumed. Alicia took her seat at the bench, her presence commanding the room's attention. The defense began its cross-examination of a key witness. Their strategy as transparent as it was insidious, to undermine the credibility of the prosecution's case by sowing doubt and leaning into biases. Camille Harper, the prosecutor, stood firm, countering each point with precision. But Alicia could see the strain in her posture, the way her jaw tightened each time the defense interrupted or dismissed her arguments. It was a reminder of the double burden they both carried, not just to do their jobs, but to prove, again and again, that they deserved to be there. Objection, Your Honor, Camille said, her voice steady but edged with frustration. The defense is leading the witness. Objection sustained, Alicia replied, her tone firm. She fixed the defense attorney with a pointed look. Mr. Pierce, I trust you'll refrain from leading questions moving forward. Pierce raised his hands in mock surrender, his expression dripping with insincerity. Of course, Your Honor. The session continued, the tension in the room mounting with each exchange. By the time court adjourned for the day, Alicia felt the weight of the proceedings pressing down on her. But as she returned to her chambers, she was met with an unexpected visitor. Reverend Charles Bennett stood outside her door, his presence a calm but powerful reminder of the broader struggles they both faced. Reverend Bennett, Alicia said, opening the door to let him in. What brings you here? I thought you could use some company. He replied, his voice warm but serious. And maybe a reminder that you're not alone in this fight. Alicia gestured for him to sit, her expression softening. I appreciate that. It's been a challenging week. Bennett nodded, his eyes steady on hers. I heard about Daniels, and I've heard the murmurs in this courthouse. You've stirred the waters, Judge Monroe. Alicia smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. It's not the first time. No, Bennett said, and it won't be the last. But you're making people uncomfortable in the best way. You're forcing them to see what they'd rather ignore. And yet, Alicia said, her tone thoughtful, it feels like every step forward is met with resistance. It is, Bennett agreed, but every step forward also leaves a mark. A reminder that change is possible. Even if it's slow, even if it's painful. Alicia leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. Sometimes I wonder if it's enough. Bennett leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. It's more than enough. You're doing what needs to be done. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Don't underestimate the power of that. His words stayed with her long after he left. As the evening sun cast long shadows across her chambers, Alicia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, and the challenges would only grow. But she was prepared to face them, one battle at a time. Because the quiet burdens of justice, no matter how heavy, were always worth carrying. The courthouse was quieter than usual, but Alicia Monroe knew better than to trust the stillness. Silence in a place like this wasn't peace, it was tension holding its breath. She had felt it all morning, an undercurrent of unease threading through conversations, lingering in glances that darted her way and then quickly averted. The trial had reached its climax. Today, the defense would rest its case, and the jury would begin deliberations. The gallery was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. But Alicia's focus wasn't just on the proceedings, it was on the dynamics playing out around her. The unspoken rules dictating who was seen, who was heard, and who was ignored. As she stepped into the courtroom, the murmurs in the gallery hushed. The defense team, led by Robert Pierce, was already seated, their expressions a mix of confidence and calculation. Across the aisle, Camille Harper stood near her table, her notes neatly arranged, her posture straight despite the visible strain of the past weeks. Alicia caught her eye and gave a subtle nod, a quiet acknowledgement of solidarity. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced, and Alicia took her seat at the bench. The defense began their closing arguments, Pierce's voice smooth and persuasive as he painted his client as a victim of circumstance. His words were carefully chosen, his tone calibrated to appeal to the jury's sympathies. But Alicia noticed how his language shifted subtly when referring to Camille. His condescension barely veiled. "Ms. Harper," Pierce said, gesturing toward the prosecutor with a faint smirk, "has done her best to present her case. But emotions don't constitute evidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we must focus on facts, not feelings." Camille didn't flinch, but Alicia saw the tightening of her jaw, the faint flush of anger beneath her composure. It was a tactic Alicia recognized all too well, undermining the credibility of women, particularly black women, by framing their arguments as emotional rather than rational. When Camille rose to deliver her own closing arguments, her voice was steady, each word measured and deliberate. She dismantled the defense's narrative piece by piece, her logic sharp and unassailable. But Alicia could see the toll it was taking. Every interruption, every subtle slight, was a battle Camille had to fight on top of the one she was already waging for justice. As the session adjourned, Alicia returned to her chambers, her mind still buzzing with the weight of what she had witnessed. She had barely settled into her chair when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and Camille stepped inside. Her expression was calm, but Alicia could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Judge Monroe," Camille began, closing the door behind her, "I just wanted to thank you for your fairness throughout this trial." Alicia smiled faintly. "Fairness is my duty, Ms. Harper, but I appreciate your words." Camille hesitated, then sat down across from Alicia. It's not something I encounter often, especially not in cases like this." Alicia leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "What do you mean?" Camille sighed, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the frustration beneath. "You've seen how Pierce treats me, how the jury looks at me. It's like I have to work twice as hard to prove I belong here. And even then, it feels like it's not enough." Alicia nodded slowly. "I know that feeling well." Camille met her gaze, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "How do you deal with it? The constant doubt, the quiet dismissal of everything you've accomplished?" "You confront it," Alicia said, her voice firm but gentle. "Not every time, because that's a battle you'll never win. But when it matters, when the stakes are too high to let it pass, you stand your ground. And you remind yourself that their doubts are not your truth." Camille nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think it will ever change?" Alicia paused, considering her answer. "Change is slow. It comes in pieces, not waves. But every time we hold our ground, every time we refuse to shrink, we push the needle forward. It's not just about us, it's about paving the way for those who come after." Camille's shoulders relaxed slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, Judge Monroe. That means a lot." That evening, Alicia attended a dinner hosted by the local bar association. It was an event she couldn't easily avoid, though the thought of navigating its unspoken hierarchies left her weary. The room was filled with lawyers and judges, their conversations a mix of professional camaraderie and subtle posturing. Alicia moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and polite smiles, but she couldn't ignore the moments when conversations shifted as she approached, or the way some people addressed her with a tone that bordered on patronizing. "Judge Monroe," a man's voice called, drawing her attention. It was Robert Pierce, his expression as smooth and calculated as it had been in the courtroom. "A pleasure to see you here, Mr. Pierce," Alicia replied, her tone cool but cordial. "Enjoying the evening?" "Oh, always," Pierce said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "And you? I imagine these events are quite different from the courtroom." Alicia raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "Not as different as you might think." Pierce chuckled, though there was no warmth in the sound. "Well, it's always refreshing to see someone rise through the ranks on merit." The insinuation hung in the air, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Alicia didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, the backhanded compliments, the subtle attempts to undermine her. But she wouldn't give Pierce the satisfaction of a reaction. "Merit is an interesting concept, Mr. Pierce," she said, her tone measured. "It often seems to depend on who's defining it." Pierce's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered. "Touché, Judge Monroe, touché." As he walked away, Alicia felt a flicker of satisfaction, though it was tempered by the familiar frustration of knowing the battle was far from over. The evening continued, its undercurrents of tension and hierarchy a reminder of the work still to be done. But as Alicia left the event and stepped into the cool night air, She felt a renewed sense of purpose. The unspoken rules that sought to constrain her would not succeed. She had spent her life breaking them, reshaping them, and she would continue to do so for herself, for Camille, and for all those who came after. The fight wasn't over, but Alicia Monroe was not one to back down. The verdict had come in. After hours of deliberation, the jury found the defendant guilty on all charges. Justice, for now, seemed to have been served. The courtroom exhaled its tension in a collective murmur of relief and anticipation. But Judge Alicia Monroe remained composed. She delivered the sentencing with the same calm authority that had defined her career. Her voice unwavering as she outlined the consequences for a man who had wielded his power with reckless abandon. Yet, as the gavel fell and the room began to empty, Alicia felt no triumph. Justice was a delicate balance, a fleeting moment in a world determined to tip the scales. She had secured it for one case. But the forces at play, the biases, the unspoken hierarchies, the entrenched systems of privilege remained untouched by a single ruling. When the gallery had cleared, Alicia sat alone at the bench, her fingers resting lightly on the wood. It was a rare moment of stillness, a chance to reflect on the battles fought both inside and outside the courtroom. The weight of it all pressed against her, but she knew she couldn't let it crush her. Not yet. The afternoon passed in a blur of paperwork and brief conversations. By evening, Alicia found herself at a community forum hosted at a local library. The event had been planned weeks in advance, a chance for residents to discuss issues of justice and inequality with local leaders. Alicia had agreed to speak, though she knew the audience would bring their own questions, their own frustrations. The room was small but full, the air buzzing with the energy of people determined to be heard. Alicia took her place at the front, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. She began with prepared remarks, speaking about the importance of community engagement, the role of the judiciary, and the need for systemic change. But it wasn't long before the questions began. A woman in her 60s stood first, her voice trembling with emotion. "Judge Monroe," she said, "I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen how people like us get treated in this system. You talk about justice. But how do we trust it when it's failed us so many times?" Alicia met her gaze, her own voice steady but warm. "Trust is built, not given," she said, "and I know this system has failed you, failed so many of us more times than I can count. But the fight for justice isn't just about trusting the system. It's about holding it accountable. It's about showing up, even when it feels like nothing will change. Because every push, every demand, every act of resistance, those are the things that make change possible." A man near the back raised his hand next. "But what about the people in power? The ones who don't want things to change? How do you fight them when they hold all the cards?" Alicia paused, choosing her words carefully. Power isn't just about who holds the cards, it's about who sets the rules of the game. And those rules can be challenged. They can be rewritten. It takes time, and it takes persistence. But history has shown us that change is possible. The people who resist it aren't invincible, they're afraid. Afraid of losing the privilege they've built their lives around. And that fear is their weakness. The questions continued, each one a reminder of the deep mistrust and frustration that lived in the hearts of so many. But they were also a testament to resilience, to the refusal to give up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Alicia answered each one with honesty and conviction, her own frustrations tempered by the knowledge that these conversations were part of the fight. As the forum ended and the crowd dispersed, Alicia lingered, speaking with a few attendees who had stayed behind. Among them was a young woman who introduced herself as Maya, a law student inspired by Alicia's career. "Judge Monroe," Maya said, her voice filled with both admiration and uncertainty. "How do you keep going? How do you stay hopeful when it feels like nothing ever really changes?" Alicia smiled faintly, her gaze thoughtful. "Hope isn't something you wait for, Maya. It's something you create. Every time you show up. Every time you push back against injustice. You're building hope not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. And that's what keeps me going." The night was cool and quiet as Alicia drove home, the city lights flickering like distant stars. She thought about the day, the trial, the forum, the questions that lingered in her mind like echoes. The fight for justice was never ending, its challenges growing with each step forward. But she had long accepted that reality. When she reached her home, she sat for a moment in the silence of her car, her hands resting on the steering wheel. The weight of the day pressed against her. But so did the quiet strength that had carried her this far. Change was slow, frustrating, and often invisible, but it was also inevitable. As long as there were people willing to fight for it. Alicia Monroe was one of those people. She always had been. And as long as she drew breath, she always would be. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The road ahead was long. But she was ready. She had to be. For herself, for her community, for the future.